For this discussion, I want to consider the key nutrients that a horse requires. It's practical when thinking about horse nutrition to consider feedstuffs. What should I feed? What shouldn't I feed? However, I think a better place to start is with a discussion focused on the specific nutrients that a horse needs, those that should be included in the horse's ration, but also an understanding of those that are provided by the horse's own tissues or by the microbial population in the hindgut, and so don't need to be included. So I'm going to discuss the horse's nutrient requirements rather than specific ingredients at this point in time. Then we can consider which feedstuffs can be used to provide those nutrients, keeping in mind what we know about the design of the horse's gastrointestinal tract. To give some context to the discussion that we're going to be having and kind of reflect back on, I'm going to cover the take-home messages right now. You can classify key nutrients that the horse requires in a variety of ways. I'm going to put them into two categories. The first are those that are essential and must be included in the horse's ration, and the second category are the non-essential nutrients. Still key nutrients, but they can be made by the horse's own tissues or by the microbes in the hindgut, which can make them available to the horse to use. Essential nutrients are a number of them. First and foremost, I consider water. Water and salt are really the only two nutrients that you can reasonably expect a horse to consume on an as-needed basis in appropriate quantities, although I'm sorry to say, and I'm sure you're familiar with instances, that there certainly are horses won't drink enough water, and horses that don't eat enough salt, and even that smaller population of horses that actually overeat salt. Energy is typically provided by forages and cereal grains along with fats. Fats might be those naturally occurring in feedstuffs or supplemental fats. In all cases, that energy or calories is necessary for the horse to maintain its body weight, to work, if it's young, to grow. Minerals are essential because they're inorganic substances, which the horse cannot make and the microbes cannot make, and therefore they have to be included in the ration. How much varies a good bit. Some minerals are needed in much larger quantities than others, but all of them are essential. There's also the fat-soluble vitamins A and E that needed to be included in the diet. If we look at the non-essential category, those are the ones that don't have to be included in the ration because the horse's own tissues, their microbial population will synthesize them, making them available to the horse. You're talking about the water-soluble vitamins and some of the fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamin D, vitamin K. So what is the list of key nutrients? It includes water, energy, and a subset of energy really is fat as a source of energy. Most energy in the horse's ration is provided by carbohydrates in the form of forages and cereal grains. You also have quality protein, a minimal amount of fat, as I've mentioned, in order to provide absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. So that's really separate from its function as a source of energy. And then you have minerals and you have vitamins. Those are the major classifications. If we compare the amount of each classification of key nutrients that you can see in this pie chart, right, we can see that the water makes up the bulk of the weight. So water is in the blue. Over 3/4, right, of the amount of mass that the horse ingests. This is a pie chart that's been comprised for an 1,100-pound horse, which if it's consuming hay at 2.5% of its body weight, so it's very dry, maybe 85% dry matter, will readily drink 12 gallons of water. Drink more if it's hot and humid, if it's working hard, but let's just say 12 gallons of water. I consider water to be the most important nutrient simply because the lack of water will kill a horse faster than any other lack of any other nutrient. Right? How many days can a horse go without water? Not very long. You can see that on a weight basis, it's the largest proportion. And I sometimes think that because water is an obvious nutrient and essentially free, many horse owners don't think a lot about their horse's water requirement and therefore don't provide sufficient amounts. Compare that to the need for energy, which you see here in red. When a horse doesn't get enough energy, it loses weight, becomes thin, gets too much energy, the excess is stored in adipose tissue and the horse becomes fat. It's quite obvious. It may take a while before it's apparent that the horse has lost weight, or take a little while before it's apparent that the horse has gained too much weight, since we're used to looking at them on a daily basis, especially in the winter when they have a fuzzy coat. Because the effects of too little and too much energy is relatively easy to see, it makes assessment of energy status of the horse obvious. Energy in this graph, as I said in the red, with about 5% of the energy requirement made up of fat that you see here in this green area, this green wedge of the pie. A significant portion of the horse's intake, right? Then there's protein. That's in purple, and you can see it here. Protein, quality protein, by which I mean a protein that contains the essential amino acids in the right proportions and amounts the horse needs. Protein is represented by the dark purple. So a horse needs protein on a quantity basis, not that much, but important. Mineral and vitamins are needed in such small amounts. The aqua color that you see right here, if I can draw an arrow pointing at a very thin sliver, is the mineral requirement, whereas the vitamin requirement is such a small slice of the total. We're talking about bulk here, mass. It doesn't even show up in this pie chart. You'd have to have a bigger pie. For many horse owners, they can seem almost unimportant, the vitamins and the minerals. When you couple that with the length of time that can elapse between when mineral or vitamin deficiency and deficiency symptoms show up, it may not be too surprising that the importance of minerals and vitamins are frequently overlooked. Personally, I blame some of the oversight on the fact that we are so used in this culture to the fact that people foods, what we eat, are supplemented with vitamins and minerals to the extent that we don't worry about it. We have vitamin D fortified milk. We have vitamin E fortified this and that. Lots of times it doesn't even cross our mind. And, we have iodine in our salt. We just don't have to think about it because the food industry has really thought about it for us. But we don't really have that in the horse industry unless you purchase commercial feed stuff that has been formulated to meet all those requirements. Something we need to be thinking about. I want to point out an abbreviation I've used in this slide. What you'll see is the NRC listed here. You may be familiar with that or you may not. It stands for the National Research Council, and then in this context, the National Research Council's nutrient requirement for horses, which is the most recent one that was published in 2007, which is really recognized as a standard for the base level of nutrient requirements for horses. So that's where these values came from, that an 1,100-pound horse eating 2.5% of its body weight will have this much water, et cetera, et cetera. And then the proportions of protein, vitamins, and minerals that it needs in its diet. I've said that I consider water to be the most important nutrient. Water is needed for many reasons. I've listed just some of them here, mostly related to the nutrition of the horse and the gastrointestinal tract health, since that's the focus of this particular course. Water is important in the production of saliva, which moistens the feed and allows for easy swallowing. as well as buffering the acidic pH in the horse's stomach. It's also important in the movement of the digestive through the GI tract, kind of lubricates things, helps move them along. When a horse drinks, water flows quickly down the esophagus and into the stomach. Much of it will flow across the surface of the food mat in the stomach and exit through the pyloric sphincter, and so it doesn't flush feed out of the stomach prematurely. That's not an issue they have to be concerned about. Water sloshing down the GI tract tube, along with involuntary peristaltic smooth muscle contractions of the GI tract tube wall, helps move that digest along. This is especially important since the GI tract is folded and coiled with regions of changing diameter, 180-degree hairpin turns. With insufficient water, partially digested feedstuff can become lodged in the tract. It's just too dry to move along. Horses will continue to eat, even when the tract is partially or even completely occluded. It doesn't seem to stop them until they actually have pain. They become uncomfortable, which then, of course, aggravates the situation. Water is important in the chemical reactions of digestion in the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract. Without water, the digestive enzymes can't function. Additionally, once digestion has occurred and nutrients are absorbed, they are transported throughout the body and the general circulation, made up mostly of water, and distributed to the various tissues that need them. In instances when the horse consumes certain pathogens or toxic compounds in its food, the body that recognizes that will attempt to rid itself of the harmful substances by flushing them out of the body, by secreting an excess of water back into the GI tract lumen, helping to propel the digest along, or maybe through the urine in an effort to flush whatever's noxious out. While not related directly to the gastrointestinal tract, water is also very important in the horse in terms of thermal regulation. Nothing sweats as much as a horse, which is really important since a horse has such a large muscle mass in proportion to its size. The muscles of a working horse generates a lot of heat as a byproduct, and that heat must be dissipated to keep everything working well. Dissipation of the heat is generally accomplished by the evaporation of sweat, which is mostly made up of water. For all of those reasons, as well as others, drinking water should always be made available. I'm going to assume that we agree that water is extremely important. Spend a little bit of time on it. Water balance is determined by the sources of water and the water that is naturally lost. So the water coming in, when I say the water going out, is the water that's retained. The primary source of water depends mostly on what the horse is eating. We typically think of drinking water as the horse's primary source of water, which is frequently the case. If the horse is eating dry feedstuffs, such as hay, cereal grains, those feeds are so dry, like 85% dry matter, the horse must drink water to meet their needs. However, if the horse is eating fresh pasture, which is itself 70 to 80% or more water, then it gets much of the water that it needs that way. It doesn't need to drink as much. It does need to drink some. Horses that are put on pasture, even lush vegetative pasture, without access to drinking water, have a much higher incidence of impaction colic than do horses in that same setting that given access to drinking water, even though they don't drink what it seems to be like that much water. That's the explanation on this slide for that 20 to 85% range of how much water is drinking. Depends on what they're eating. Fed hay, a horse will meet 85% of its water requirements by drinking water. It's grazing, it'll drink much less. The difference is particularly striking when a horse is taken off pasture and placed in a stall or a dry lot and fed hay. If it's been an abrupt change, if there hasn't been a transition, the change in how much the horse will drink. It needs to drink more because now it's eating dry feedstuffs, but there's an acclimation period for it to actually kind of get back up to, or get up to the level of voluntary water consumption that it needs. Moreover, there is a transition period as the horse adjusts to the change of sources of water. Horses develop a taste for water. They like, just like if you live in the city, you like city water. If you live in the country, you like well water. And there's a taste to it. And horses are very sensitive to taste. As I mentioned earlier, water is important in various chemical reactions that occur in the body. During some of the reactions, water is actually generated, what we call metabolic water. And although the amount of water that can be generated through metabolic processes varies by species. For the horse, approximately 10% of its requirements can be met that way. While not a source of water per se, it should be kept in mind that the horse's hindguts can serve as a temporary reservoir for water. So when a horse drinks water or consumes it as a large component of his feed, water can actually be held in the hindgut in association with that feed. When needed, water can be pulled from the lumen of the GI tract reservoir into the body proper if the hydration status of the horse requires it to do so, in order to maintain an optimal balance of water in the body proper. This reservoir is a source of water during those periods of times when water need exceeds what's immediately available for the horse to drink. Water goes in and water goes out of the gastrointestinal tract tube. Water can be lost in the feces. It certainly does. The amount varies by horse to some extent. It differs more based on what the horse is eating. If on pasture, feces have a lower dry matter and a higher moisture content, more water than horses consuming hay. And you've seen that whenever you've had to pick out a pasture versus cleaning out a stall. Water is lost via urine, though it can be concentrated in the adult horse if they're not receiving enough water. Water is lost through sweating in order to regulate its body temperature that we've talked about, and to a lesser degree, water is lost through respiration. There are multiple factors that affect how much water a horse will drink, such as water quality. If the water is contaminated with algae or sand, feces of wild animals, maybe in a pond or a stream from upriver, all those things decrease the quality of the water, which negatively impacts voluntary water consumption as a rule. The taste of the water can affect how much a horse will drink. If you're a person used to city water, I mentioned that as an example, horses are very sensitive to tastes that are familiar to them, and those are the ones they prefer. Temperature of the water plays a big role. There have been multiple studies assessing how the temperature of the water impacts how much a horse will drink. Overall, horses prefer water that is between 44 and 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Horses will drink much less, maybe 40% less, when the water is just above freezing. Think of going out and breaking the ice off the top of the bucket, or hatcheting through the ice on the pond and scooping up a bucket of water for your horse to drink. Horses will drink, but compared to how much they would drink if the water was more temperate, is substantially less. When it's hot outside, especially if it's also humid, horses drink more. The need for more water goes up even more when they're physically active, exercising or working. The horse regulates its body temperature when it's hot, primarily by sweating, and at times sweating a lot. If a mare is pregnant or lactating, water intake needs are greater. If a horse is ill, water intake may go up or it may go down. When a horse stops voluntarily drinking much water, the circumstances can be quite dire. We've already talked about how what the horse eats affects how much it will drink. The differences are due to both the amount eaten and the composition of what is eaten. Horses eating a high moisture forage drink less than horses eating dried forages. I mentioned that. Horses eating a mix of grain and hay drink less than horses eating only hay, even though the dry matter content is the same. Recall that the production of saliva, which is mostly water, is increased when the horses are eating dried forages or any feedstuffs that require a lot of chewing. An important consideration is whether the horse will drink enough water. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, there's 3 different ways of kind of calculating or determining how much water your horse might drink. They're all roughly the same quantity based on the weight of the animal, based on the weight of the feed, weight of the water and weight of the feed, or just on a daily basis. And it really doesn't matter so much other than as a rough idea how much your horse will drink. The goal is to have water, clean, fresh, temperate water in front of your horse at all times. And the goal would be to maximize water consumption. Even though energy is not considered a nutrient by the strict definition of a nutrient, it's typically the next key component that we consider in the horse's ration. Energy will be used for basic metabolic processes that sustain life. Metabolic reactions require energy to fuel them. Energy is used to not only maintain the status of the body, but to meet the increased demands due to growth, reproduction, exercise, or work. I mentioned briefly that when energy in the ration is less than needed for maintenance, the horse becomes thin. So if we look at this graph, what you see is animal health and performance, and you can use whatever criteria you'd like to determine or how you evaluate health and performance. But what we know is that when the horse is thin, with a body condition score of 1 to 3, a body condition of 1 is close to when an animal is not going to survive. It's much more marginal if the body condition is a 3, but it's not a safe body condition score. I mean, it's underweight. There's concern. The horse is going to have trouble regulating its body temperature, etc. And then we have that kind of Pollyanna, Goldilocks, just right. Body condition score of 4 to 6, which is what is really considered optimal. So let me just orient a little bit. So the body condition score is increasing along this axis. If the horse consumes too much calories, too much energy, it's going to become overweight. Body condition score, without any clinical signs, there may be some diminishing of health and performance status, but you can't really put your finger on it. As the horse continues to gain weight, continues to become fatter and fatter, it will develop some clinical symptomology indicating that it's having some health issues and certainly some performance issues, and those can reach a disease or a disorder state if the animal continues to gain weight. Now, is that the case for all overweight horses? Absolutely not. But there certainly is an increased risk for some disorders and some diseases associated with obesity in the horse. Certainly the most prevalent sources of calories or energy for the horse is in the form of carbohydrates, predominantly the structural carbohydrates, cellulose and hemicellulose found in forages, which can be used by the microbes in the hindgut through fermentation, generating volatile fatty acids as byproducts, which can be absorbed and across the GI tract wall and then used by the horse as an energy source. To a lesser extent are the carbohydrates found in high concentrations in cereal grains, so starch content. Starch can be broken down in the horse's foregut by the horse's own enzymes, and the resultant glucose molecules can be absorbed across the gastrointestinal tract wall, and that glucose can be used as an energy source as well. Fats are found in forages and cereal grains at relatively low concentrations, although you should keep in mind that fats contain 2.25 times as much energy on a per gram basis as carbohydrates. So fats are quite energy dense. They are digested in the foregut, and the fatty acids that are liberated from that digestion are going to be absorbed in the foregut as well. I've listed proteins on this slide as a source of energy, but note that proteins are not an appropriate source. While they are digested and absorbed in the foregut, the metabolic economics of the digestion and utilization of proteins as a source of energy are really inefficient. So amino acids are not an efficient energy source. Where you see protein being used as an energy source is when a horse is starving. So if a horse is not being fed enough and is losing weight, then it will start to catabolize or degrade its own body tissues, predominantly starting with the skeletal muscle mass and liberating the amino acids from its muscles in order to use those as an energy source. Certainly not an ideal situation. As I mentioned earlier, fats are a very dense source of energy that contain about 2.25 times as many calories on a weight basis as cellulose or starch. But in addition to serving as an energy source, fats play very important roles that can't be replaced by any other nutrient, so need to be in the horse's ration. We don't usually think about having to add fats or taking fats into account when balancing a ration, and that's because even though fats are necessary, the amount and type of fat required can be met by the fats that occur naturally in the traditional feedstuffs, forages, and cereal grains, so that supplemental fats aren't actually required. Dietary fats, those found in typical feedstuffs, also serve as a source of essential fatty acids for the horse. Essential is the same that we've referred to that term in the past. They have to be included in the diet because they can't be manufactured by the horse's tissues, and that includes a marker here, linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid. They sound a lot alike. You can see the spelling isn't too much different, and actually structurally they're not a whole lot different. Using those fatty acids as starting material, the horse's own tissue can convert them into other physiologically important fatty acids that the horse needs. The presence of fats in the diet facilitate the absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A and E, both of which are also essential and so need to be part of the horse's ration. Having fats in the diet are instrumental in ensuring that those vitamins, A and E, can cross that gastrointestinal tract barrier. There are instances in which providing supplemental fat can be a good choice. When it's hot outside and the horse is working hard, it generates a lot of heat, which has to be dissipated. When fats are fed as an energy source, the amount of heat that they generate as a production of that metabolism is less than what is produced by the metabolism of carbohydrates, especially those carbohydrates digested by the microbes in the hindgut. Feeding fats reduce the heat load on the horse, so it can be a good choice in the summer when it's hot for a hard-working horse. I do want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the structure of fats, mainly because of the interest that horse owners have in understanding the omega-3 versus omega-6 fatty acid controversy. In this upper panel, what you see is a picture of a triglyceride. Might also be a little, you see it written as a triacylglyceride. And it consists of a glycerol backbone, which is essentially 3 carbons. So you're going to have a carbon here, you're going to have another carbon here, you're going to have a third carbon right there. And attached to that is this fatty acid, which is a carbon chain. And the fatty acids may all be the same, or they all may be different, or 2 may be the same and 1 different, or whatever. During digestion, what happens in the foregut is one of these fatty acids gets cleaved off and gets liberated and can be absorbed. And this fatty acid gets cleaved off and is liberated and can be absorbed. And it's possible that this one gets liberated and absorbed, or it's also possible that it would stay with the glycerol backbone. In the lower panel, what you see is then what one of these fatty acids would look like. So it's just a chain of carbons, this carbon being represented by this red dot, carbon molecule. And each carbon is connected to the next carbon through a bond. And there might be one bond, as in saturated, or there might be a double bond, and that's considered unsaturated. If there's one double bond, it's considered monounsaturated, and if there's more than one, it's considered polyunsaturated. And the importance of that has to do with what the horse's body's tissues can do in terms of saturation or desaturation or elongation of an existing fatty acid. And that is reflected in which fatty acids are considered essential and which are not. So I want to spend just a couple minutes in the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid controversy. Both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids play important roles in the body. The one role that has sparked controversy is the balance between the two. How much omega-3 to omega-6 should you have? And also, how much you need in an absolute amount. For the horse, we really don't know. Much of the information you find about the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratio for horses is really an extrapolation from what we think we know about other species. So what is the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid? So you already know that a fatty acid is a link of carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon. They can either have a single bond or a double bond. And what you see on this half of the slide is the omega-6 fatty acid, or linoleic. And what you have is the carbon at this end, the initial carbon at this end. And if you count the number of carbons up, what you see is that carbon 6, I can draw, is the location of the first double bond. So linoleic acid has 18 carbons, it has 2 double bonds, and the first one occurs at carbon 6. So the first one is at carbon 6, and the second one is a carbon 9. Okay? More than you really wanted to know. Omega-3 fatty acid, on the other hand, is also 18 carbons. Here's the first carbon. If you count, the first double bond occurs at carbon 3. And then the rest of them are just the same as what you saw with linoleic acid. So alpha-linolenic has 18 carbons. It has 3 double bonds, and the first one occurring at the third carbon. So one double bond different between these two fatty acids that everybody's talking about. But you can also see, based on the structure, that they're really shaped differently. When you put another double bond in there, you actually form a kink and actually changes the shape. So we know a little bit about what the structure is. We know a little bit about the differences. So what's the big deal? And the big deal is, in as much as we understand it, is that you have the omega-6 pathway and you have the omega-3 pathway. And the omega-6 pathway gives rise to these series 2 prostaglandins preferentially, and they tend to be more inflammatory in nature, whereas the omega-3 goes down through this pathway, and they give rise to these series 3 prostaglandins, oops, and they tend to be less inflammatory. The reason they talk about a ratio is because this first set of steps in the pathways use the same enzymes, which means it's likely that there is actually competition based on the quantity of these 2 fatty acids in terms of which pathway gets preference. So something pro-inflammatory sounds really bad, but it is absolutely normal and essential so the body knows to fight off, to respond appropriately under conditions in which inflammation is appropriate. But you don't want too much, but you don't want too little. So what is the balance? And I'd have to say right now, we really, really don't know. So the controversy surrounds of how much and what the ratio is, and we do not know the answer. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question about the controversy because we don't have an answer. Next key nutrient. We're going to switch gears and talk about protein. When we think of protein, it's easy to think that proteins are all the same. They're consistent or fairly uniform. We think of it as a percent of protein in a feedstuff. And in their mind, it's easy to assume that they would be similar. 10% protein in one feedstuff would be similar to 10% feed in another feedstuff. However, while there are common characteristics across all proteins, there are tens of thousands of different proteins in the body. There's easily as many in feedstuffs. And the proteins relevant to horse nutrition are made up of 22 different amino acids. And the easiest way for me to think of them and explaining how they actually differ from each other is that let's kind of think of them as like a separate letter in an alphabet, okay? So I'm going to say those 22 amino acids are like the 26 letters of the English alphabet. If you arrange those 26 letters in different orders, you make different words. The number of words that can be made from just 26 letters, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, I looked this up, is over 170,000 words. Then, of course, you can arrange those words differently to make different sentences, and you can arrange the sentences differently to make different paragraphs, and paragraphs to make, well, you get the idea. The diversity is astounding, starting with 26 letters. And proteins are very much the same. There is a seemingly endless possibilities when proteins are made, limited only by the number of each type of amino acid that is available. You link one amino acid to another. So if you look up here, you have this amino acid, glycine, nucleic acid, arginine. Okay, here's another arginine. So think of these as letters in a word. Another glycine. This is very heavily arginine. Here's a threonine. You skip to phenylalanine. You get the idea, right? So this would be like one long word. And then that would be like the primary structure. Amino acid connected to amino acid forming essentially a word or a peptide. And then you can combine different peptides or these links of amino acid together to form proteins. And they have a secondary structure would be like sentences, and a tertiary structure like paragraphs, and a quaternary structure like a book. And again, you have all this range of possibilities. But what happens when you try to make words and you don't have enough of the letters that you require, right? Think of the game Scrabble. You don't have some of the vowels you need or some of the consonants to make a specific word that would use up all the rest of them. You can't make the word you want to make, so you don't get any points. Similarly, if your horse doesn't have the specific amino acids it needs to make a particular protein that it needs in its body, it can't make it, even if there's an excess of the other amino acids that are available. Think too many consonants and not enough vowels, like in Scrabble. So the horse can do a couple different things. If it's chronically deficient in a particular amino acid, it could break down its own body tissues to liberate the amino acid, that particular amino acid from a tissue that is considered less necessary, so that it can be used to make a protein that is considered more necessary. That is not a good situation to find yourself in. So where do the amino acids the horse needs come from? Some have to come from the diet. Those are the essential amino acids that I've talked about, the 22 essential amino acids. Some can be made by the horse using pieces of the essential amino acids that were in excess. The ones the horse can make are called non-essential amino acids, not too surprising. Then there's that in-between category, kind of semi-essential or conditional amino acids that need to be made under certain conditions, certain circumstances or conditions. Maybe when there's an increased demand for an amino acid that can't be met by the synthesis of the horse itself. So normally they can be made, it's non-essential and the horse makes it, but if there's an increased demand for it and the horse's synthesis can't keep up, then it would be really considered essential. Or if the precursors to the amino acid is in too short a supply, then it might be considered essential because otherwise it can't get made unless it's provided in the diet. So think of it that way, and that brings us to the concept of protein quality. A quality protein is one that contains the amount of individual amino acids and the ratio of amino acids to each other that are needed by the horse. Ideally, the protein would have just enough of those essential amino acids and in the correct ratio so they can be maximally utilized and then are left over. There's no excess, there's no waste. I need to tell you right now that we don't know that information for the horse. They do know it by and large for some of the other species. Swan. Proteins are used to build, maintain, and repair the body's tissues. Proteins are involved in every single cell structure. As a horse grows, it consumes the amino acid it needs and makes the others in order to make the proteins necessary to maintain its body, extra proteins for growth. It's also necessary to replace the proteins in the body, so the need for protein is continually occurring throughout the horse's life. And the proteins that last the longest need replacement less frequently, with those that are more short-lived have to be replaced more often. So when you're trying to figure out what particular amino acids an animal might need, say in this case the horse, what you're going to have is an increased requirement for the amino acids that are found in the short-lived proteins because they're going to turn over more quickly than the ones that are in the long-term proteins. We know that a horse needs protein in its diet to provide the essential amino acids that it can't make on its own, even though we don't know how much of each amino acid is required. Until we know more about the individual requirements, we rely on the process of crude protein as an indicator of protein content without regard to the amino acid content. And crude protein is an estimate of total protein. What happens is that all amino acids contain nitrogen. We have means to measure the nitrogen, and then because the nitrogen component of amino acid makes up on average a certain percentage, close to 16% of the structure of amino acid is nitrogen. It varies because this R group is a variable, which is what makes the different amino acids different from each other. But you can determine how much nitrogen is there, do a mathematical conversion, and get a estimate of the protein content, and it's called crude protein because you're going to have non-protein contributions of nitrogen to that measurement. So not knowing the amino acid requirement, or even really the amino acid content of what you're feeding, usually, the tendency is to make sure we provide a lot of protein, hoping to meet the individual amino acid needs. Usually that approach doesn't take into account that proteins from different sources have different amounts and ratios of amino acids. Think of it as have differences in terms of quality. You might have a lot of protein providing a lot of amino acids, but if the protein is made up of predominantly just a few amino acids, the other essential amino acids aren't being provided. Think of it as, okay, we're going to go back to the Scrabble game. I was never very good at Scrabble. Think of you're playing Scrabble and you have a lot of the letters X, Y, and Z, but you don't have much of the others. You're not going to be able to make words. If that's what you have in amino acids, you're not going to be able to make proteins. Let's say you make a good choice and are feeding a high quality protein that has the amounts and ratios of amino acids that your horse does need. Even so, the tendency is to kind of overshoot the mark, right? You feed a little bit more. Ask yourself, what happens to that excess protein? There are really two fates for excess proteins, since amino acids that aren't needed aren't stored in the body to be used later. So when we think of glucose, excess glucose, it might be stored as glycogen in the muscle or converted to glycerol and forms part of adipose tissue. If you feed in excess of fatty acids, that's going to be stored in adipose tissue. Feed in excess of some minerals, those are going to be stored in the liver or the spleen or in the bone. There's no real storage mechanism for excess amino acids. So what happens is instead that amino acid is stripped of its amino group. So this is an excess. This is a amino acid that can't be used and isn't needed. So this amino group gets stripped off, and it can be used to make, in conjunction with a different carbon backbone, to make a non-essential amino acid, or it can enter the urea cycle and be excreted as urea in the urine. Right? So it's just eliminated from the body. The backbone that's left over can be used to as an energy source to making fatty acids, go through gluconeogenesis to make glucose, those which can be stored or used later. However, I want to emphasize here that to do so with the carbon skeleton left behind once the amino group is stripped off is a highly inefficient process, and isn't a good source of energy for the horse. Again, this is what's happened when a horse is in starvation. It will mobilize amino acids from its proteins, strip off the amino group, and use the carbon skeleton to generate some energy as the horse is starving. Minerals and vitamins are next on the list of key nutrients, but before I split our discussion into one on minerals and one on vitamins, there are some general characteristics that they share that I want to cover. Now you've seen this general figure already, where the y-axis reflects the animal's health and or performance, and the y-axis, in this case, is the amount of nutrient that's being consumed. And we've talked about how having too low an amount can result in death. Having too much can result in death, and kind of everything in between. The main point I want to make here that's different than what we discussed before is that this optimal range, how much of a span it covers from here to here, will vary by the individual nutrient. So let's say what is safe for one nutrient you maybe have from this point to this point maybe 10 times as much, or it might be 100 times as much, or it might be 5 times as much. So it really does vary by the individual nutrient. And it's good to know what is, at what level things are too low and when things can become too high. I have certainly run across instances where, with the best of intentions, some nutrients are fed in excess and run into this region of marginal, even approaching toxicity, because they've exceeded this optimal range. Minerals are inorganic essential nutrients and that they must be provided in the horse's ration. horse can't make minerals. Minerals are taken up by the plants, and the horse eats the plants, and therefore gets the minerals. Minerals are involved in building and maintaining and repairing tissues. The most obvious example would be the mineral requirement for bones. Tremendous amount of calcium and phosphorus, and to a lesser extent other minerals make up the mineral component of bone. But just like all tissues, bone tissue has to be maintained. Approximately 10% of bone is replaced every year, even in an adult that is no longer growing. As bone mineral is lost, it needs to be fixed, replaced. Always keep in mind the balance that is dependent on the ongoing processes of synthesis and degradation occur in most tissues. Minerals play key roles as cofactors of enzymes, as components of hormones, regulation of nerve and muscle function, as well as regulating through osmotic pressure body fluids, and a myriad of other functions throughout the body. The charts on the right list the major minerals that you see here that are needed on a gram per day basis. Let me get my marker here going. And then also trace minerals that are needed on a milligram per day basis. So quite a bit of difference in terms of absolute quantity. Major minerals are calcium and phosphorus, potassium and sulfur, magnesium, sodium and chloride, while the trace or minor minerals are iron, manganese, copper, zinc, selenium, iodine, and cobalt. I think where the problem comes into for some people is that the amount of trace minerals that are required seems so small as to be almost inconsequential, and therefore they tend to get ignored. And also it's not easy to understand just how much is needed and how much is present in the feedstuffs that they're using. It can be quite confusing. If you're feeding typical feedstuffs, for example forage, the forage plants will contain the minerals that they took up from the soil. The fact that the minerals are in the feedstuff doesn't necessarily mean that they are available to the horse. Bioavailability determines whether the mineral you include in your horse's ration as part of the feedstuff can be used by the horse. The biggest hurdle in mineral bioavailability is absorption across the gastrointestinal tract wall. The factors that affect absorption across the gut wall include the physiological status of the horse itself, its age, its health, its current nutritional status. Young horses absorb minerals differently than do mature horses. If the horse is sick, absorption can be compromised. If the horse's nutritional status is compromised, a series of metabolic changes that can occur could affect bioavailability. If the amount of the mineral in the ration is substantially lower than what is required, the amount of mineral absorption may increase. There are some absorption mechanisms that are responsible for transporting more than one mineral across the gastrointestinal tract wall. If there's an excess of another mineral that shares that mechanism, the competition may result in an imbalance in what is absorbed, even if the absolute amounts found in the feedstuff are in excess of the requirement. Likewise, there are substances in the feed that can interfere with the efficient mineral absorption. Vitamins are needed in the smallest absolute amounts of any of the dietary nutrients, and as such, they tend to be overlooked. They play key, critical roles as coenzymes in the enzymatic reactions for growth and development and functions of all the body tissues. Vitamins are usually categorized as either fat-soluble or water-soluble, and that's based on their chemical composition. The fat-soluble vitamins includes A, D, E, and K. And the water-soluble vitamins are vitamin C and the B-complex vitamins. So thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, pantothenic acid, pyroxine, biotin, folic acid, and cobalamin. These categories can be further subdivided into essential and non-essential. Similar to the other nutrients we've discussed, essential vitamins must be included in the horse's ration, while the non-essential vitamins can be synthesized either by the horse's own tissues or by the microbes in the hindgut. Of primary concern to the equine nutritionists are the fat-soluble vitamins A and E, since they are both essential and therefore had to be included in the ration. You know that I've listed vitamin D as both essential. Let me find my little marker here. So here's A and E as being essential, but I've got D listed there. But I've also put D in the non-essential category. So how can that be? It's kind of that conditional kind of category, or quasi-essential. And that has to do with the fact that Vitamin D is not something that needs to be included in the ration if the horse is exposed to sunlight, since vitamin D is formed in the skin when the horse has irradiation by sunlight. But if you keep your palomino or your black horse inside during the day, turn it out during the night in order to preserve its coat color, or you have a horse with an injury, it needs to be on stall rest. There's one little tiny window in the corner, and your horse stands there kind of looking out at the other horses. Those horses probably need to be supplemented with vitamin E. In terms of water-soluble vitamins, none are considered essential under typical circumstances. So what might be considered non-typical circumstances? If you have a horse that has had a kind of a chronic infection, is on long-term antimicrobial treatment for an extended period of time, that can really disrupt the microbe population in the hindgut. We don't really know what all the changes that occur. But we do know that there are instances that it causes a reduction in some of the B vitamins and a vitamin K production. Really, any significant disruption in the microbe population might be a circumstance in which the vitamin B and vitamin K should then be incorporated into the ration. I would say that in general, this is not a usual occurrence. There are numerous factors that impact the bioavailability of vitamins, just as there were for minerals. Many of them are, in fact, the same factors: the health, the nutritional status, and the management of the horse. Whether vitamins are water-soluble, which are more readily absorbed, or fat-soluble, less readily absorbed and requiring the presence of fat in the ration. And the diet in terms of the amount of vitamin it contains, as well as the presence of substances that could negatively impact the absorption of the vitamins. So in review of the key nutrients, just the list that we've talked about. Water, which I consider the most critically important, and frequently the amount needed is underestimated, especially by the first-time horse owner. But even a small amount below what is required for optimal digested transit through the gastrointestinal tract can prove hazardous. Energy, calories needed for the maintenance and growth of the body. It's easy to tell that energy status, which is really very nice. If your horse is thin, it's not getting enough calories. If the horse is too fat, then it's receiving too many calories, something that can be adjusted. Fat can be a source of energy, but aside from that, it's needed in small quantities, which are usually present in sufficient quantities in traditional feedstuffs, forages, and cereal grains in order to facilitate fat-soluble vitamin absorption and provide the essential fatty acids necessary for a variety of metabolic functions. Protein is probably one of the most challenging aspects of the horse nutrition at this point in time, I would say. Everything is calculated right now in terms of dietary requirement based on crude protein, which is an exact measurement of both protein and certainly no measurement of what the individual amino acids are. And it really wouldn't do too much good to measure what the individual amino acids are because we don't know what the requirements are, either in terms of absolute quantity or in ratios, although every little piece of information is helpful. Minerals are inorganic, have to be consumed, therefore are essential. Some are needed in larger quantities than others, and those are the ones that people usually think about. Those are the ones you're also going to see typically listed on a feed tag. And then you have the vitamins. And vitamins are also essential. At least some of them are, others are not. The vitamins have a couple different characteristics that make them, I guess, unique in the list of key nutrients. They're needed in the smallest absolute quantities of any of the other nutrients, and also they can be quite vulnerable to degradation. So whereas minerals can withstand just about anything, vitamins tend to be much more fragile and readily degraded. So the quality of the vitamin has to be taken into account. As we discussed in the beginning, the take-home messages from the discussion on key nutrients falls into two categories. Those that are essential and must be included in the horse's ration, some of which should be provided ad libitum or free choice, such as water and salt. Other essential nutrients must be managed so the horse does not get too little or too much, both situations which can lead to problems. The second category is non-essential nutrients that are made by the horse's own tissues or by microbes, which are made available to the horse for use, unless, of course, things aren't what they would consider normal under extenuating circumstances.